Okay, everyone. The first thing I would like to talk about, the ABCs of spirituality, is I'd like to the best of my ability, define these very common terms that are used all over the place. Define the terms awake, asleep, awake, awakening, self-realization, and enlightenment. There are so many people from all walks of life using these terms. And, the conspiracy theorists use awake, and the spiritual guru uses awake. And I'm wondering, are they both really awake? And what does that term mean? These terms mean something completely different in the Eastern tradition as they do from Western traditions. So before we begin defining it, let's just all agree, I know you know this, that in all of us, there are essentially two yous, that's hard to say, two yous vying for the driver's seat, so to speak. So we have the ego. I'm sure you've heard this term. The ego is the mind complex, the ego-mind complex. And then we have what you might say is your spiritual self, your true self. And I'm going to use the term awareness or consciousness as the spiritual self. So we have these two yous inside of you. Now, the question to ask in defining these terms is, which you is asleep? Which you needs awakening? Mind, ego complex, or consciousness? Okay? The answer is different depending on if you're coming from a Western use of the term and Eastern use of the term. So let's just start off with the Eastern, and I would say the correct definition of these terms, because we probably got these terms from the Eastern traditions, right? Excuse me. So asleep. What does asleep mean? It means that the answer to who is asleep, which self is asleep, it's not the mind. It is the consciousness inside of you that is asleep, that needs awakening. So, the sleeping person is the consciousness. So there's about enough consciousness in people that they are self-aware. They are aware that they can perceive things, and you are perceiving that I'm talking. You have awareness of your body. You can reflect on yourself, and you don't even have to close your eyes, but you can close your eyes and you can see that you're having thoughts, okay? So you are aware that you have thoughts. And the true you is that space behind the thoughts that is aware of the thoughts. It's that kind of empty aliveness, peacefulness, wholeness space. That's your consciousness, okay? So in the sleeping, that consciousness is only tiny bit awake. And it has become, the consciousness is asleep, and it has become like Velcro mixed in with the ego mind, so much so that it has become identified with it. It thinks it's the ego only, the ego and the body, mind-body complex, okay? It can't see the forest for the trees. It can't see that it's the forest and the trees. The consciousness doesn't know itself to be consciousness. It thinks it's the ego, mind, personality complex. So we can say, almost everybody in the world is asleep, right? Okay, so what does awake then mean? Awake, so in the Eastern tradition, they use the term awake, self-realization, and in some arenas, enlightenment, to be synonymous with the consciousness waking up to itself. Now, how does that happen? This is through meditation practice and self-inquiry, and it's the inward journey. It's when people go on this journey, they take the inward journey. It's all about meditation, being silent, and going within. They're seeking their true self, okay? And what happens is, through those practices, there comes a time, an event, or they have a spiritual awakening, and something happens, and they have a direct experience of their true nature. And what happens is that consciousness that was so identified over here suddenly goes, and it kind of is ripped off the Velcro. Its identification with the ego mind complex is ripped out, and this consciousness experience itself directly. It suddenly wakes up and goes and sees that it is everything, no thing, everywhere, nowhere. It's everything. It's totally unmanifest awareness. Okay? This is a shocking event, and if this awakening is strong enough, it sticks with the person. And this realization, when the self recognizes itself, is a visceral experience as well. Now, the body experiences it. The cells in your body, which are consciousness, they wake up too. So your whole being knows this to be true. And you can never undo that knowing. Okay? So that's what being awake or having self-realization means. Now that is, when that awakening event happens, it's not a full, it's not as clean as that, right? There's a very long time of integration and deepening and processing and purging. And it's a very uncomfortable time, but the consciousness never goes back to being fully identified. There's still some pieces of consciousness that are stuck on that ego Velcro that need to be worked out, but eventually it gets to be fully separated. It's kind of the wrong term, but it's completely unidentified with the mind-ego complex. Okay, so that's being awake, living awakened awareness. The awareness inside of the person has been awakened. And we would say that is like, in my opinion, other people have different explanations for what enlightenment or self-realization are, but this is my understanding. You can say that self-realization is the very first, like you're putting your one foot, peering over, you've stepped one foot onto the ladder of enlightenment. Enlightenment is an embodiment process, okay? Now, some people may go zero to everything, but most of us go through a progressive system. Okay, so what is enlightenment? Well, there's levels of consciousness that after self-realization is one level of consciousness, and there are a couple of more. So what happens is the consciousness inside of you now, once that awakening, that disidentification happens, it creates a bridge to your multidimensional self, your Merkaba, your light body, or we call it the causal body, creates a bridge, and that awakening Now begins the process of the embodiment or descension of your multidimensional body into your physical body, while at the same time, that self-realization causes such a rise of your frequency. You went from like this level of consciousness to this level. So it's a process of ascension and descension. Your physical body is raising in vibration, ascending up to meet the descension of your causal body energy. And as it embodies fully into your lower chakra, your heart chakra, throat chakra, etc., these are the stages of embodiment. And when it fully lands, now we can say that your DNA now has been uncovered. The light of your DNA is now shining. The body, your physical body, is now enlightened when the causal body is fully embodied. Now that would be considered enlightenment, and that is a progressive happening. There's a word there that I can't think of. Okay, so we understand now what the Eastern traditions mean, that awake, awakened, or self-realization all mean the same thing, and enlightenment is sort of this embodiment of the causal body, or your Merkaba, or your multidimensional self, which is a ascension and descension process. Okay, in the West, everybody and their brother says they're awake. From the conspiracy theorist to UFO researchers to the entire spiritualist movement that's happening right now, from all the light workers start, et cetera, et cetera. So the people in the East would say, we're all nuts over here. None of us are awake. Or many of the people on the spiritual journey who say they're awake, they're not awake. They're still sleeping. Okay. I'm just saying that in Eastern tradition, this is what they would say. So, and they're right. Okay. Many people just waking up probably have not had this huge spiritual awakening, okay? Because if you did, you would know it. It's shocking. And you tend to forego, it kind of ends your seeking. It's just the beginning of your spiritual journey, I'll tell you that. After self-realization, the true spiritual journey really begins. But what happens is your seeking ends. All the interest in spiritual, metaphysical things, like they get totally dissolved. So what is happening in the world today, maybe not so much spiritual awakenings. What's happening is we're having an explosion of mind openings, mind awakenings. Ego openings. And this, I will talk about this in another video, but this is such a critical stage of the spiritual journey. It's also a very dangerous stage, but it is not where we want to go. We have to pass through this, but in order to really deliver and incite the kind of change that we want on this planet, to truly raise our vibration, we have to get to the other awakening, okay? But anyway, this is a necessary step to have this mind opening, okay? Yeah. So why did I feel this was important to talk about these terms? Here's why. Based on my experience, I started in this metaphysical journey, when I was 10 or 11 years old. And I can tell you that all my playing around in this spiritual metaphysical world, it was fun, it was great, but there was something inside of me that was bored with it, that already knew it somehow, and still felt this deep, incessant yearning of going home. Now, before I understood, now I know what was happening, but before I understood, I thought, oh, I'm just depressed. Let's commit suicide and get off this planet. And I have a feeling many of you might be feeling this way. So if you've kind of been playing around in this metaphysical journey and it's not doing it for you, you feel this longing to be with God. Maybe you wouldn't use that term. I didn't use that term, but that's the feeling. You want to go home. I suspect, as in was the case with me, you in a previous life had already had the stirrings of your mind opening up, and you were already doing this metaphysical spiritual journey in another life. You kind of just reawakened to it. You kind of feel at home with this. You understand everything everyone's telling you. And I suspect it's not working for you because the consciousness inside of you is beginning to stir. And it's trying to say, let go of this. Stop seeking outward for home. It's time to turn inward, to begin a serious, semi-serious meditation practice, self-inquiry. Move your attention inwards and begin to ask the questions, why? Who am I? What am I? Okay? This is where the longing to go home, sorry, there was a fly, is coming from. The consciousness inside of you wants to wake up. It's not depression. It's not your ego saying it's time to check out. Turn your attention to the other part of the journey and go on YouTube and look up all the people talking about consciousness, not awakening, but consciousness, teachers like Rupert Spira. God, my mind just went blank. Muji. There are so many brilliant teachers, and I just went completely blank. Just go to the YouTube channel, Buddha at the Gas Pump, and there's over 500 interviews of all these beautiful, spiritually awakened, self-realized teachers that I think you might resonate with, that would point you in another direction. So the point is, if this spiritual metaphysical journey is kind of leaving you still longing for something deeper, don't give up. There's nothing wrong with you. It's just the consciousness inside of you is asking you to go in another direction. Okay? Don't check out now. Check in. That's what we want to do. Okay. So I hope all of that made sense. In awakening, it has nothing to do with the mind. It is the consciousness inside of us, in all of us, that needs to really wake up. Because as I think Ramana Maharshi said, the greatest service that you can do for this planet and for others is your own self-realization. Because when that happening occurs, the consciousness level that, what it does is does more for the collective, waking up the collective, than any kind of sending love and light, connecting with your twin flame, self-development course you can imagine. Okay? Self-realization is where we all need to go. We need to start turning inwards. Okay. Thank you, and I hope you enjoyed this, and I'll see you next time.